What would you do if the most humiliating night of your life was interrupted by a child with a message that changed everything? Duke Adrian Blackwood arrived at an elegant London tea room, expecting nothing more than an awkward blind date arranged by his persistent sister. Instead, he found himself sitting alone at an empty table, certain he had been stood up until a little girl stepped up to him, looked him in the eye, and said, "My mommy's late." In that single moment, irritation turned to curiosity, and a quiet evening meant to be forgotten became the beginning of something no duke, no matter how powerful, could have planned. A lonely nobleman, a weary mother, and one fearless child are about to collide in a story of scandal, tenderness, and the family no one expected. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now let's begin the story. A wet spring evening had settled over London in a veil of silver mist, softening the hard outlines of the city and turning every gas lamp near Hyde Park into a blurred golden halo. Rain had passed not long before, and the streets of Mayfair still gleamed with reflected light. Wheels hissed over damp stones, hooves struck the road in an even rhythm, coach lanterns glimmered and vanished beyond the drifting vapor. Inside Whitcomb House, one of the most discreetly fashionable tea rooms in that quarter of the city, the atmosphere was warm, polished, and entirely undisturbed by the weather outside. Fine porcelain clicked softly against silver spoons. The low murmur of cultivated voices rose and fell like music practiced so often it no longer required thought. Ladies in silken lace leaned toward one another over china cups. Gentlemen in dark coats sat with measured ease, their posture as carefully tailored as their cravats. It was the sort of room in which nothing impolite was ever said aloud and very little escaped notice. At a table near the tall front window, Duke Adrian Blackwood sat alone. An Earl Grey that had long since cooled rested before him. One gloved hand lay beside the untouched saucer. The other rested lightly near his folded napkin. He wore black evening cloth cut with quiet perfection, a white shirt, an immaculate cravat, and the composed expression of a man who had been taught from childhood that self-command was not a virtue, but a duty. He sat very straight, not because he was uncomfortable, but because it had never occurred to him to do otherwise. From time to time, he looked toward the window, watching carriages pass through the yellow wash of the lamps outside. Then he looked back toward the entrance, then to the clock over the mantel, then once more at the tea cooling on the table. He should not have been there at all. This absurd arrangement was entirely his sister's doing. 3 evenings earlier, Lady Margaret Blackwood had stood before the drawing-room fire at Blackwood Manor, one hand resting against the marble mantel. Her expression, set in the determined way Adrian had learned, meant resistance was useless. You cannot live the whole of your life among ledgers, estate agents, and tenant reports, Adrian, she had said. You need a family. He had lifted his eyes from the document in his hand and regarded her with that mild reserve which in others passed for calm, and in him was often mistaken for indifference. "I already have a family," he had replied. "I have you." Margaret had sighed with theatrical patience. "And I do not intend to move into your manor forever, simply to prevent it from sounding like a mausoleum." He had almost smiled at that, though she knew him too well to be deceived by almost. "I am not in need of matchmaking," he had said. "You are in need of life," she had returned. "There is a difference." When he did not answer, she had stepped nearer. "She is not like the women people parade before you at dinners and music halls. She is kind, intelligent, and stronger than she ought to have had to become. Just meet her once. If you dislike the entire idea, I will never mention it again." That Adrian had said dryly is a promise I do not believe. And yet, He had come, not because he believed in blind meetings arranged over tea, not because he had suddenly developed a hunger for companionship, certainly not because he imagined romance might be waiting in a room full of polished wood and pale china. He had come because Margaret had looked at him with a kind of helpless affection that made refusal feel meaner than consent. So now he sat at Whitcomb House with a cooling cup of tea and an empty chair across from him. The irony, he thought, was almost elegant. In London, society the name Blackwood drew immediate recognition. Adrian had inherited the title 3 years earlier upon his father's death, and with it came Yorkshire lands, London holdings, country tenants' investments, trustees, obligations, and an endless succession of men who wished to discuss them. He managed everything with a severity of precision that impressed bankers, intimidated stewards, and disappointed hostesses. He appeared at the necessary balls, dinners, and parliamentary gatherings. He spoke when spoken to. He danced when duty required it. He remained impeccably civil. Then he left. There were stories, of course. There were always stories. Some said the Duke of Blackwood was too cold to love anyone. Some said he had once cared deeply and had been betrayed. Some said he intended never to marry, so that no woman might interfere with his authority. Others, less poetic, simply thought him proud. The truth was less dramatic and much lonelier. He had been a child when his mother died, old enough to remember the softness of her hands and the warmth of her voice, too young to defend those memories against the long winters of silence that followed. His father had been a disciplined man, stern in grief, and sterner still in habit. He did not rage. He did not collapse. He simply sealed every door through which tenderness might have entered and raised his son inside the echo. Blackwood Manor had always been large. After his mother's death, it had become enormous. Adrian had grown up in long corridors, high-ceilinged rooms, and formal dinners where silver shone brighter than conversation. Even after he became master there, even after every servant looked to him, and every room stood open at his command, he had never once mistaken the place for warmth. It was a house of lineage, responsibility, and inherited order. It was not and had never been a home. Margaret understood that. It was the reason she had pressed him toward this evening with such uncharacteristic insistence. Just meet her, she had said when he was leaving the manor earlier that night. Once. That is all I ask. He had given no answer then, but he had taken the carriage into London. Now he withdrew a silver watch from his pocket and opened it with one practiced motion. The minute hand had moved far enough to suggest insult. He shut the case softly and slipped it back into his coat. A waiter approached, immaculate and discreet. "Your Grace, would you care for fresh tea?" "No, thank you." The man bowed and moved away. Adrian glanced around the room. Every other table had achieved its expected arrangement. A married pair shared cakes near the fire. A cluster of elegantly dressed ladies spoke behind feathered fans with measured amusement. Two gentlemen near the back had already ordered a second pot and were deep in some discussion of business or politics. Only his table remained asymmetrical, one chair occupied, the other empty. The irritation that had been gathering in him all evening tightened another degree. Not because he was unaccustomed to waiting. Waiting was a condition of rank. Men waited for votes, for agreements, for letters, for signatures, for weather, for horses, for other men to stop speaking. But being left alone in a tea room by a woman he had agreed against his better judgment to meet because his sister had begged him to do so was a different species of discomfort altogether. He could already hear Margaret's voice. "Well, did you stay long enough even to be polite?" He set down his napkin. Enough. He lifted one hand to summon the bill and rose from his chair. At that exact moment, a small voice beside him said, "Excuse me?" Adrian turned. A little girl stood near his elbow. She could not have been more than 4 years old. Her pale blonde hair had been gathered back, though several soft wisps had already escaped and curled near her cheeks. She wore a light blue dress slightly rumpled from travel, and the hem of it bore the faintest darkening, as if it had brushed a damp carriage step. But what arrested him was not the dress, nor the absurdity of finding a child alone in a room like this. It was her expression. She was looking up at him with solemn blue eyes of such determined seriousness that for a moment he thought she must have mistaken him for someone far older and wiser than himself. "Are you the Duke?" she asked. He was so startled by the directness of it that he almost laughed, though the sound never reached his throat. He bent slightly, bringing himself nearer her eye level. "I am afraid I am." She nodded as if a suspicion had been confirmed. Then, with the grave precision of a messenger discharging official duty, she said, "My mommy's late." He blinked. For one strange second, he thought he must have heard her incorrectly. "I beg your pardon?" She drew in a small breath and spoke faster, as though repeating something learned by heart. "Mommy said she's very sorry. She had to work longer and the babysitter didn't come." Adrian looked instinctively around the room, expecting some flustered woman to appear from behind a chair or some anxious nursemaid to rush in from the door. No one came. He looked back at the child. "You are speaking of tonight." She nodded again. "Mommy tried to send word, but maybe you didn't get it." He touched his coat pocket absently, recalling that he had silenced the small instrument through which messages sometimes reached him before entering the tea room, determined that nothing should interrupt what he had expected to be an orderly, if unnecessary, encounter. "She's outside," the little girl continued. "She said it isn't proper to bring a child to a meeting with a duke." Despite himself, a smile touched Adrian's mouth. "And yet, here you are." She considered the matter before answering. "Yes." Why, she looked at him very seriously. "Because you looked lonely through the window." The words landed with absurd gentleness and surprising force. Lonely. No one in London would have chosen that word for him. Reserved, perhaps. Proud. Severe. Untouchable. But not lonely. And yet the little creature before him had looked through a rain-flecked window and seen him with more accuracy than half the city's drawing rooms ever had. He straightened slowly, a warmth he had not expected stirring beneath the layers of habit and restraint. Then he held out his hand. "Would you be willing to show me your mother?" She placed her small fingers in his without hesitation. Together they crossed the polished floor of Whitcomb House and stepped out into the damp spring evening. The street still shone from the recent rain, and the gas lamps cast long reflections over the stones. A cool breeze carried the scent of wet earth carriage leather and distant smoke. Just as he was about to leave, the daughter of the woman he was supposed to meet suddenly walked up to him. What would you do in that moment? Would you stay or walk away? Tell us what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before we move into the most unforgettable part of the story. Just beyond the entrance, near the glow of a lamp fixed to the tea room wall, a woman stood half turned away, one hand gripping the edge of a light cloak, as if she could not decide whether to enter or flee. She turned at the sound of the door. Adrian saw her face for the first time. Miss Eleanor Whitmore. Her hair was deep brown and simply arranged, the kind of arrangement made for practicality rather than display, though several damp strands had worked loose and softened the line of her cheek. She looked tired in the way only truly overworked people do, with shadows beneath clear eyes and the faint stiffness of someone who had not sat down all day. Yet there was a quiet grace in the way she held herself even in distress. When she saw the child's hand in Adrian's, her eyes widened. Clara. She came forward at once, crouching slightly toward the girl before lifting her gaze in alarm to Adrian. "You must never go inside alone like that." "I only told him, you're late," Clara said. Miss Whitmore closed her eyes briefly, as if summoning patience, and then looked up again, plainly mortified. "Your Grace, I am deeply sorry. I had already decided to leave. I never meant to waste your evening." He studied her for a moment. She bore none of the polished assurance of the women he usually met in London drawing rooms. There was no calculated charm in her, no airy confidence, no flirtatious ease. But there was something far rarer, honesty without self-pity. "The woman who was to watch Clara did not come," she said quietly. "I could not leave my daughter alone, and I could not think what else to do. I understand entirely if you prefer not to continue this meeting." Adrian glanced at Clara, who was still holding fast to his hand, as if she believed he might disappear if she let go. Then he looked back at her mother. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "it seems to me that if we have come this far, it would be a pity not to have dinner." For a second, she simply stared, unable to decide whether she had heard correctly. "Are you certain?" He inclined his head. "I believe Clara has made the circumstances perfectly clear." Clara smiled with immediate triumph. Something in Eleanor's face shifted, then not ease, not yet, but the first fragile hint of relief. And Adrian realized with a faint astonishment at himself that he no longer wished to leave. He opened the door and let them enter ahead of him. The waiter nearest the entrance tried and failed entirely to conceal his surprise when the Duke of Blackwood returned not alone, but in the company of a young woman and a child. To his credit, he recovered within seconds and moved forward with impeccable restraint. Their table by the window still waited for them. A smaller chair was found for Clara, who was settled solemnly between them, like an appointed negotiator responsible for keeping the peace between two nations. For the first several minutes, the awkwardness was impossible to ignore. Adrian poured fresh tea into Eleanor's cup. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I fear this is not the evening either of us expected." A faint color rose in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or suppressed laughter, he could not tell. "No," she admitted. "I did not imagine I would arrive late, breathless, with a child in tow, to meet a duke. Nor did I imagine," he said, "that my first explanation for a failed appointment would be delivered by someone under 4 feet tall." Clara looked between them, sensing humor without fully understanding it. "Is this a bad dinner?" she asked. "No," Adrian said at once. Eleanor smiled despite herself. "No, darling, merely an unusual one." That seemed to satisfy her. She examined the room, then tugged lightly at Adrian's sleeve. "Mr. Duke," she said, "may I tell you about my picture from school?" He turned toward her with a gravity one might have expected him to reserve for a cabinet minister. "I think that is a matter of great importance." The child's whole face brightened. She launched into the story at once. A yellow house, a large tree, a cat of remarkable and probably impossible size, and a sky that had required both blue and green because ordinary blue was not enough for weather. Adrian listened with complete attention. He asked whether the cat had a name. He asked why the tree was darker than the roof. He asked whether the house in the picture belonged to the cat or to the people who had lost the cat. Each question produced a thoughtful pause and an answer delivered with intense seriousness. Across from him, Eleanor watched with open surprise. It was obvious that she had not expected this. A man of his rank, his reputation, his manner, such men generally tolerated children at best. They did not inquire into the interior logic of oversized cats painted in questionable skies. But Adrian listened as though Clara's picture were the most significant subject discussed in Whitcomb House that evening. When she stopped at last to sip water, he said, "Miss Whitmore, your daughter, possesses unusual narrative gifts." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound low and warm. "She spent the entire afternoon practicing that story on me. I can tell," he said. "It has structure." That made Clara glow. Their dinner arrived soon after. Eleanor was served salmon. Adrian accepted beef. Clara received a small plate prepared with more kindness than elegance, and attacked it with the calm efficiency of a child who had forgotten entirely that she was part of an adult occasion. As the first awkwardness eased, conversation shifted. "My sister told me very little," Adrian said after a moment. "Only that you were kind, sensible, and unlike anyone else she had introduced to me." "That sounds like Margaret," Eleanor said. "She is not inclined to offer too much information when she thinks it might frighten people away." "I assure you," Adrian said dryly, "she has made a career of frightening me into social arrangements I never requested." That drew another quick smile from her smaller, this time more private. He set down his knife and fork. "What work detained you this evening?" Eleanor's expression changed immediately. Not darkened exactly, but turned inward, steadier. "I am a nurse at St. Bartholomew's Children's Ward." The answer surprised him enough that it must have shown. "A difficult profession." "Yes," she said, "and sometimes heartbreaking. But I do not know what I would do if I were not there." Clara inserted herself with pride. "Mommy helps babies that are hurt." Adrian looked at the little girl. "Then your mother must be very brave." Clara nodded emphatically, as if there could be no rational disagreement on the matter. Eleanor lowered her gaze for a moment, perhaps to hide the emotion that had touched her expression. "And you, Your Grace?" she asked lightly, turning the conversation back upon him. "Margaret says you spend most of your days with estates and stewards, among other things. Blackwood Manor, Yorkshire, leases London Holdings, tenants' accounts, the usual collection of matters attached to land and title." Clara looked up. "Is your house very big?" He considered how one answered such a question honestly to a child. "Yes," he said, "very." "How many rooms more than are necessary?" She thought about this. "Do you use them all?" "No." "Then why keep them?" He almost laughed outright then. Eleanor hid a smile behind her cup. "I inherited them," he said, at last. "That is not an answer," Clara declared. "No," he admitted. "I suppose it is not." Eleanor's eyes lingered on him a moment longer than courtesy required. He realized she had noticed what few people ever did. He had spoken of Blackwood Manor without pride, as though it were not a prize but an obligation. Not something beloved, only something managed. The meal continued in that strange, unexpectedly easy pattern. Clara interrupted with observations. Eleanor translated those observations into adult sense when needed. Adrian found himself asking questions without calculation, answering without reserve. At length, after a small quiet had settled over the table, Eleanor drew a careful breath. "There is something I should say plainly," she said. He looked at her. She folded her hands once, then let them rest again. Clara's father left before she was born. There was no tremor in her voice. That more than anything told him how often she had had to say the words aloud. He did not offer pity. He hated pity himself and saw no reason to inflict it on anyone else. That cannot have been easy. "No," she said simply. It was not. Clara, who had been dividing the remains of her dessert into mysterious categories, looked up. "Mommy says we are a team." Adrian smiled at her. I believe that entirely. Eleanor's expression softened. We manage. After a moment she asked, And your family? He looked down at the tea in his cup. My mother died when I was young. I'm sorry. He inclined his head slightly to acknowledge the courtesy of it. My father believed sentiment weakened judgment. He was not unkind in the ordinary sense, merely disciplined beyond comfort. He did not know why he was telling her this. He was not a man who discussed his childhood over supper, least of all with near strangers. Yet the intimacy of the little table, the child between them, the absence of performance in Eleanor's face, something about the evening had loosened, a bolt, long rusted shut. Blackwood Manor was always full of servants, he said, but rarely of laughter. Eleanor did not speak. She did not rush to soothe or fill the silence. She only looked at him with a gaze in which sympathy and recognition met without intruding. It was perhaps the first moment in years Adrian felt fully understood by someone who did not share his blood. By the time dinner ended, Clara was losing her battle against sleep. Her sentences shortened, her blinks lingered too long. At last she leaned against Eleanor's side and whispered, Mommy, I'm tired. Adrian set down his glass. If you will allow it, he said, I can take you home. Eleanor hesitated at once. That is too much to ask. It is not, he said. She glanced at Clara, whose head was already drooping, then back at him. You have been kind enough already. I assure you, Miss Whitmore, my carriage will survive the errand. That earned him the smallest laugh. It sounded tired, but genuine. A short time later, they stepped back into the damp night. Adrian's carriage waited under the lamps. The footman opened the door. Eleanor settled Clara between them, and within minutes the child had fallen completely asleep, her head tipped against her mother's arm. Eleanor adjusted the shawl around her. She always falls asleep when the carriage begins to sway. Adrian looked at the child's peaceful face. She trusts easily. Eleanor's answer came after a slight pause. Children do, until someone teaches them otherwise. The words remained with him the rest of the journey. They drove into a quieter part of the city where the houses were smaller and closer together, the lamps fewer, the sound of fashionable traffic more distant. At last the carriage stopped before a modest building on a narrow street. Eleanor stepped down first and turned back. This is where we live. Adrian gathered Clara into his arms before she could wake. She was surprisingly warm, surprisingly light. The child stirred, once murmured something incomprehensible, and settled against him with the unquestioning trust of deep sleep. Eleanor unlocked the door and led the way up a short flight of stairs. The apartment she opened was small, far smaller than any drawing room at Blackwood Manor, but the first thing Adrian noticed was not its size. It was its life. Lamplight lay warmly across worn but polished furniture. Children's drawings made in thick wax colors were pinned to one wall. Crooked houses, trees, suns too large for proportion animals rendered with heroic inaccuracy. A small shelf held neatly stacked books. Wooden toys had been placed in a basket in one corner. There was a teapot on the side table and a knitted blanket draped over the back of a sofa that looked frequently used rather than merely displayed. He lowered Clara carefully onto the sofa. She curled at once onto one side. Eleanor drew a light blanket over her and brushed a hand over the child's hair. Adrian stood still. It struck him then, with almost physical force, that this little apartment contained more warmth than all the magnificent rooms of Blackwood Manor combined. Not wealth, not beauty in the grand sense, but warmth. The soft breathing of a sleeping child. The faint scent of tea. Drawings on the wall no curator would permit and no one loved enough to remove. Signs of being needed. Signs of being known. Eleanor straightened and turned toward him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for this evening, for not leaving, for all of it." He looked once more around the room. Then he said very softly, "Miss Whitmore, I believe this is the first time I have seen a place exactly as it was meant to be." She followed his gaze, perhaps seeing the apartment through his eyes for the first time. "It is only a very small flat." He shook his head. "No, it is a home." Her expression changed then just slightly, but enough that he knew the words had reached her more deeply than a polished compliment ever could have done. He took his leave soon after. Eleanor walked him to the door. They stood for one brief moment in the narrow hallway, the quiet between them no longer awkward, only new. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night, Miss Whitmore." When he descended the stairs and stepped back into the London night, the air seemed altered, though the mist still drifted and the lamp still burned in the same patient rows. Something had shifted. He entered his carriage and sat in the darkness, not yet giving the order to drive. For years he had moved through his life with perfect competence and very little anticipation. Days followed duties. Evenings followed days. Seasons passed across the estates. Tenants married crops, changed investments, rose and failed governments argued, and the rooms of Blackwood Manor remained what they had always been: orderly, impressive, empty. But now, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Adrian Blackwood found himself wanting tomorrow to come quickly. He wanted to see a little girl explain the weather in impossible colors. He wanted to hear her mother laugh again. And somewhere in that recognition, quiet and unwelcome only because it was so wholly new, he understood that the evening he had nearly abandoned had not disappointed him at all. It had unsettled him, in the best and most dangerous way. And when at last the carriage began to move, carrying him back through the wet-lit streets of London toward the vast silence of Blackwood Manor, he knew with a certainty as strange as it was undeniable that he was no longer merely a duke who had waited alone at an empty table. He was a man who had quite without meaning to begun to hope. In the days following that first dinner, Adrian discovered that the life he had always considered sufficient had become unexpectedly difficult to resume. The routines remained. Estate papers still arrived in neat stacks. Solicitors still requested his signature. Stewards still sent accounts from Yorkshire. Men still waited for his opinion on matters of land and rent and timber and politics. He answered each demand with the same measured intelligence he always had. Nothing outwardly had changed, yet something inward had. He found to his irritation and then to his quiet surrender that his thoughts kept straying. A phrase spoken in a meeting would remind him of Clara's solemn little questions. A shaft of late afternoon sunlight across his desk would bring back the sight of Eleanor standing in the lamplight of her small apartment, one hand resting lightly on the back of Clara's sofa while she spoke to him with tired honesty. Even the silence of Blackwood Manor had altered. It no longer felt natural. It felt accusatory. 3 days after that evening, Adrian gave an order so abruptly that his valet nearly looked startled. "The carriage," Adrian said, buttoning his gloves. At once. The carriage rolled through the busy streets and stopped before St. Bartholomew's Children's Hospital in the late afternoon, when the air held that peculiar gray brightness of London before evening settled. Nurses moved in and out through the gates, some brisk and purposeful, others dragging from long hours on their feet. Adrian stepped down and waited by the carriage door. When Eleanor emerged at last, wrapped in a plain dark cloak and carrying the fatigue of a long shift in the slope of her shoulders, she stopped at once. "Your Grace?" she said, surprised enough to forget every polished phrase that might have softened the question. "What are you doing here?" He inclined his head slightly, I thought Miss Whitmore might require a ride home after a long day." For a moment she only looked at him as if unsure whether to laugh or protest. Before she could decide, a familiar voice rang out from behind her. Mr. Adrian Clara came flying out of the hospital entrance with the reckless speed only children and birds ever considered reasonable. Adrian had just enough time to open his arms before she collided with him. He caught her cleanly and felt the small body settle against him without hesitation. "You came back," she announced, as though she had been conducting an experiment and now had proof. "So it seems," he said. Eleanor's expression softened despite herself. "You should not encourage her to think people simply arrive when wished for." Clara drew back to look at him seriously. "But you did." Adrian met Eleanor's eyes over the child's head. "I believe I have been accused with evidence." That was the first afternoon. After that, his visits became less accidental and more inevitable. He came sometimes to collect Eleanor at the end of her shift, sometimes only to take Clara and her mother walking for an hour before supper. Hyde Park became the quiet geography of their strange new habit. Clara loved the ducks, the open lawns, the gravel paths that crunched beneath her shoes, the trees whose branches leaned overhead like old listeners. She would run ahead, stop to inspect some leaf or feather or stone, then turn and ask questions with the grave intensity of a scholar. "Mr. Adrian," she said one afternoon, pointing toward the lake, "do you think that duck has a house?" Adrian looked toward the water, where a fat mallard was gliding with complete indifference to all human concern. "I think the lake is his house." Clara considered this, then nodded, satisfied. "That makes sense. It would be difficult for a duck to open a front door." Eleanor laughed quietly beside him. Another day, Clara found a crooked twig and declared it a sword. Another day, she tried to count all the pigeons near a bench and became outraged when they refused to remain in one place. Adrian, who had spent years mastering the art of restrained conversation in drawing rooms full of people, discovered that speaking with a 4-year-old required far more flexibility and infinitely more honesty. He said very little about himself unless asked. He did not volunteer his inner life. Yet Clara's questions had a way of traveling through armor by refusing to recognize it. One mild afternoon, she sat cross-legged on a bench, eating a bun with jam, and looked at him over the sticky edge of it. "Mr. Adrian," she asked, "do you have children?" He shook his head. "No." She thought hard for several seconds, jam on one cheek and seriousness in her eyes. "Then you may practice with me." Eleanor turned away, but not quickly enough to hide her smile. Adrian looked at Clara for a long moment, then bowed his head with exaggerated gravity. "That is a very generous offer." "I know," Clara said, then resumed eating. It became impossible after a time for Eleanor to pretend his presence was merely a courteous extension of one awkward evening. He was entering the shape of their days, not by force, not with the grandness his rank might have allowed, but with quiet consistency. He remembered what Clara liked. He noticed when Eleanor was too tired to speak much and did not press her. He brought oranges once because Clara had mentioned them in passing. Another time he appeared with a slim, beautifully illustrated book of animal stories, explaining to Clara that every serious household required at least one fox who could talk. And if Eleanor found herself listening for the sound of his carriage far more often than she admitted even to herself, she did not speak of it. But London was a city built as much on observation as on stone, and it never overlooked what it considered material for conversation. One bright morning, when the sky had unexpectedly cleared, and Hyde Park was full of shining carriages, and ladies enjoying the weather, Adrian was walking with Eleanor along a tree-lined path, while Clara skipped a little ahead, stopping every few yards to inspect flowers. At a distance beneath a parasol edged with violet silk, Lady Beatrice Holloway turned her head and narrowed her eyes. "Is that Duke Blackwood?" she murmured, lifting her feathered fan so that only one sharp eye remained visible. Her companion followed her gaze. "It is." "But who is the woman?" Lady Beatrice watched a little longer, taking in Eleanor's plain but neat dress, the absence of any title that would have attached itself to her through carriage servant or manner. And then Clarisse, who had just run back to seize Adrian's hand and swing from it with shameless delight. "Not one of us," Lady Beatrice said softly. By the time afternoon tea was poured in 3 drawing rooms and supper laid in 2, more the story had changed shape and gained ornament. In Mayfair salons behind painted cups and whispering fans, society entertained itself. I am told Duke Blackwood has been seen walking in the park with a nurse. A nurse truly, and a child. His no hers. How extraordinary, how inappropriate, how very disappointing. A young woman in pale green at a gathering near Berkeley Square declared with delighted cruelty, "It is difficult enough to understand how a duke might amuse himself, but to do so with a common woman and her daughter, really, one would expect more discipline from him." Laughter followed. It always did. The whispers moved faster than any carriage. They crossed dinner tables, morning calls, music rooms, gaming clubs, and servants' stairwells. Adrian did not hear them immediately because men like him were often told unpleasant truths last. But Eleanor heard them. At St. Bartholomew's, where women worked too hard and knew too much of human pain to remain truly frivolous, gossip still found corners to gather in. One afternoon, Eleanor stepped into the staff room just in time to hear 2 other nurses speaking in lowered voices. "I hear the Duke of Blackwood calls for her himself. Then perhaps Miss Whitmore has been luckier than she appears." Neither woman meant real malice. That almost made it worse. Their tone carried the same easy assumption Eleanor had heard all her life. Whenever class crossed a line it should not. She did not answer. She only set down the linens in her hands and went about her work. But that day, for the first time since meeting Adrian, she felt the edges of London closing in. A week later, the whispers stepped into the open. Adrian had taken Eleanor and Clara to Hyde Park, again the air warm enough to soften the last chill of spring. Clara was chasing a butterfly through a patch of grass with the solemn determination of a hunter and the actual success of a child. Adrian and Eleanor followed more slowly along the path. "You spoil her," Eleanor said quietly, watching Clara dart after the butterfly. "She seems no worse for it." "That is because she is 4. And at 4, one should be allowed certain liberties, such as interrogating ducks and ordering dukes about. I see no fault in either practice." Eleanor smiled, and before she could answer the sound of carriage wheels cut across the calm. A glossy dark carriage drew up near the path. A footman descended quickly and opened the door. Lady Charlotte Pembroke stepped out. She was beautiful in the polished, expensive way London valued perfectly arranged hair, flawless gloves, a pale riding habit cut to emphasize elegance over practicality. For years, hostesses had matched her name with Adrian's in hopeful speculation. She had been thought suitable, clever, well-born, and entirely aware of her own worth. Her gaze moved over Eleanor once from head to toe. "Your Grace," she said, smiling with all the warmth of winter glass. "I had not realized you had developed new interests." Adrian inclined his head only slightly. "Lady Charlotte." Her eyes shifted to Eleanor. "How interesting. I had always imagined the Duke of Blackwood possessed stricter taste, though perhaps one must sometimes find diversion where one can. Is Miss, she paused with deliberate insult, Whitmore employed as a governess, or something nearer a nursery maid? Eleanor's fingers tightened around the handle of her parasol. She did not lower her eyes. She did not answer. Adrian took one step forward, placing himself very slightly between the women. Miss Whitmore is my guest. Lady Charlotte's smile sharpened. How reassuring. London will find that distinction fascinating. At that moment, Clara came running back, flushed from pursuit and faintly breathless. She slipped her hand into Adrian's. Mr. Adrian, she said. The butterfly flew away. He bent slightly towards her, not once looking away from Lady Charlotte as he answered. I'm afraid it had urgent business elsewhere. Clara seemed to accept this tragedy with admirable resilience. Lady Charlotte gave a small laugh that did not reach her eyes. I see, she said. Then I shall leave you to your afternoon. She turned and stepped back into the carriage. Only when it had rolled away did Eleanor speak. You did not need to do that. He looked at her. Yes, I did. It was not a dramatic statement. He did not say it loudly. Yet something in the certainty of it reached her more deeply than any elaborate defense could have done. It was the first time she fully understood that Adrian Blackwood was not the sort of man who would retreat from ugliness merely because acknowledging it might be inconvenient. A few days later, perhaps because he knew the insult had not passed without injury, no matter how well Eleanor had concealed it, Adrian invited her and Clara to Blackwood Manor. When the carriage turned through the tall iron gates, Clara pressed both hands to the window and gasped. Mr. Adrian, she said, staring up at the broad sweep of stone and glass before them, is this your house? He looked out toward the manor with a faint expression she could not yet read. Part of it. She turned to him in disbelief. How many parts are there? Too many. Blackwood Manor rose pale and stately beneath the afternoon light, all measured grandeur and inherited confidence. The lawn stretched green and immaculately kept. Ancient trees lined the drive. Water flashed in the distant fountain. Gravel crunched beneath the carriage wheels. The moment they stepped down, Clara ran in an astonished circle and then another. There's a fountain and trees, and more grass than all of London. Mr. Reed, the elderly butler who had served the family for 15 years and whose face generally expressed controlled resignation toward all things earthly, stood at the entrance and watched the child with open confusion. It was one thing to imagine guests. It was another to imagine a child racing around the Duke of Blackwood's front steps as though the place were a summer fair. Clara ran back to Adrian and seized his hand. Can you play hide and seek? He considered. I have never tried. She laughed with delighted disbelief. Then today, you will learn. Eleanor expected him to dismiss the idea gently and direct them indoors. Instead, Adrian looked around the broad gardens, then at Clara's eager face. Very well, he said. You may hide. She squealed and ran behind a rose hedge before he had reached 3. Eleanor stared. Adrian Duke of Blackwood, master of estates, terror of careless stewards, actually closed his eyes and counted against a tree, while a 4-year-old attempted concealment with all the practical skill of a robin under a handkerchief. From the entrance, Mr. Reed murmured to a footman, I have served his grace 15 years, and this is the first time I have seen him laugh. Because he did laugh. Not loudly, not carelessly. But when Clara burst from behind the hedge, thinking herself unseen, while one shoe remained perfectly visible, he laughed in a way that transformed him. It was not youth, exactly, nor softness, but a kind of release that made him seem more fully alive than Eleanor had yet seen. The house itself astonished Clara, though in a different way. She wandered the rooms with reverent curiosity, her small shoes tapping across polished floors. She stood beneath painted ceilings and whispered, "Do people sleep under all this?" "No," Adrian said. "Mostly they look up and pretend not to be impressed." She liked the library best after the gardens. She liked the idea that an entire room might exist only for books. She asked whether all the portraits on the walls were dead, and when told yes, she suggested that some of them looked disappointed by it. For a few hours, Blackwood Manor changed. Servants smiled when Clara passed. Reed found himself explaining the proper purpose of a bell pull to a child who immediately wanted to test them all. Eleanor, watching Adrian move through his own home with more ease than she had thought possible, felt a dangerous warmth gather in her chest. But no great house in England was ever entirely private, and no duke's home could close its doors against society's judgment for long. Later that afternoon, while Eleanor was in the morning room with Margaret, who had come to call, and who took to Clara with affectionate ease, the child slipped away in search of another portrait that looked cross. She went through one of the long side corridors where guests from a recent estate meeting were gathering their hats and gloves before departure. She stopped behind a marble pillar when she heard voices. I cannot imagine what Blackwood is thinking. Bringing a woman like that into the house, and the child as well. It is one thing to indulge sentiment in private, quite another to parade it. Clara did not understand every word, but children required little education in tone. She knew disdain when she heard it. She stood very still until the men moved on, then went back to the morning room more slowly than before. Adrian noticed the change at once during the ride back to London. Clara, usually unable to sit in silence for more than 30 seconds, leaned against Eleanor and asked no questions at all. At last, in a voice so small it seemed almost borrowed, she said, "Mommy, do people not like us?" Eleanor felt the question strike through her. She looked out the carriage window for a long moment because if she looked immediately at Adrian, she feared he might see too much. "Not everyone understands us, darling," she said quietly. "Did I do something wrong?" "No." Eleanor gathered her closer. "No, my love, you did nothing wrong." Adrian said nothing, but the hand resting on his knee had gone rigid. That night, after Clara had fallen asleep on the sofa in the apartment, and Eleanor had covered her with a familiar knitted blanket, Adrian stood near the hearth, while Eleanor remained by the table, one hand braced against it, as if she needed something solid. "Your Grace," she said at last very softly, "perhaps we should stop this." He looked at her. Why she laughed once without amusement, then pressed her lips together. Because Clara should not grow up in a world where people look at her mother as if she is a mistake a duke is making. The room was very still. Adrian had faced ministers, land disputes, bankers, and grieving tenants without flinching. He had spent his life surrounded by matters requiring judgment. Yet in that small lamplit apartment with Clara asleep nearby and Eleanor standing before him with pain, she was trying not to show he felt something he had not expected. Fear. Not of London. Not of scandal. Not of family displeasure. Fear of losing something he had only just begun to understand was becoming necessary to him. He did not answer at once, and Eleanor mistook that silence for confirmation of everything she had feared. So when he left a few minutes later, it was with the weight of her words still between them and no promise to ease them. Outside, the narrow street seemed colder than spring had any right to allow. The carriage ride back to Blackwood Manor passed through darkness and lamplight, but Adrian scarcely saw either. His mind kept returning not to the gossip itself, nor to Charlotte's sneer, nor even to the offense done to Eleanor. It returned relentlessly to the sound of Clara asking, "Do people not like us?" He gripped the leather strap beside the carriage window so hard, his knuckles whitened. He had never imagined that his presence in their lives might make Clara a target of something so mean and shapeless that it could not even be fought directly. The child did not understand rank, but she understood hurt. When he entered Blackwood Manor, the great house had returned to its usual condition, silent, ordered, perfectly appointed, and intolerably empty. Mr. Reed met him in the hall. "Dinner is served, Your Grace." "I do not want it." The butler, wise enough to recognize a boundary, only bowed and stepped aside. Adrian crossed the familiar corridors, and every room seemed haunted now, not by his past, but by a memory, only days old, Clara's feet running over the polished floor, her laughter echoing beneath the ceiling, Eleanor standing in the doorway, watching them both as if she did not quite trust her own happiness. He went into his study and stood at the window looking out over the dark lawn where no one moved. For the first time in years, he understood that Blackwood Manor was not merely lonely because it was large. It was lonely because the people he wanted in it were absent. The next morning he rang for the carriage before breakfast. "To where, Your Grace?" the coachman asked. Once he was mounted, St. Bartholomew's. The hospital smelled of soap-boiled linens and humanity held together by effort. Children cried in one ward, laughed weakly in another, coughed somewhere farther down the corridor. Nurses moved quickly. Doctors spoke in low, urgent tones. Adrian paused just inside the doorway of one room. Eleanor stood at the far end beside a narrow bed, where a thin boy of perhaps 8 lay with one arm bandaged from wrist to elbow. She bent over him and adjusted the blanket with hands so gentle that the child's frightened face eased at once. "Don't worry, Thomas," she said softly. "You'll be mending soon enough." The boy nodded, not because he was convinced, but because he believed her. Adrian remained where he was unseen for several seconds. In that moment, he understood something that had been only partly visible to him before. Eleanor was not simply a tired young mother surviving as best she could. She was a woman who spent her days carrying fear for children who were not her own, and still came home able to smile for Clara. She was capable of a kind of strength that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with love. And what frightened him, he realized then with full clarity, was not what London might say. It was the possibility of losing Eleanor and Clara because he had hesitated too long to choose them. That same evening, instead of disappearing into his study as he usually did, Adrian gave a different set of instructions. He told Reed to send notes at once to a small number of family acquaintances and close connections, people whose opinions were valued precisely because they circulated quickly. Reed raised one discreet eyebrow, but asked no questions. Within hours, word had spread that the Duke of Blackwood was holding an unexpected gathering at the manor. By 8 o'clock, the drawing room glowed beneath chandeliers. Guests arrived in controlled curiosity. Lady Margaret stood near the fire with open suspicion in her eyes. "Adrian," she said, when he entered, "I have never known you to call half of London to dinner with 6 hours' notice. What on earth are you doing?" He adjusted one cuff, saying something that ought to be said clearly. The room filled. Lady Charlotte Pembroke came, of course, because she would never miss the possibility of drama. Lady Beatrice Holloway came because gossip had become the nearest thing to religion in her life. 2 cousins, a viscount, a family friend from Parliament, and several others completed the company. When supper was done and the servants had withdrawn to a respectful distance, Adrian rose. The conversation died slowly then all at once. He stood at the center of the room, tall and composed, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. He looked around at the assembled faces of the society that had watched him his entire life, judged him when useful, admired him when profitable, and misunderstood him almost as a matter of tradition. I am aware, he said evenly, that London has found me an entertaining subject these last weeks. There were a few shifting glances, a few nervous smiles. No one interrupted. I am also aware, he continued, that many of you have been discussing a lady named Miss Eleanor Whitmore. Lady Charlotte lowered her glass just enough to smile. Adrian's gaze found her and held. Miss Whitmore is not a rumor, he said. She is not an amusement, nor an indiscretion, nor a passing curiosity to be fitted into your afternoons for the sake of conversation. The room grew utterly still. Then he said with quiet, unmistakable force, "She is the woman I love." Margaret's hand rose to her mouth. Reed, standing near the far doorway, did not move, though a lesser butler might have blinked. Lady Charlotte spoke first because wounded pride rarely tolerates silence. "Your Grace," she said coolly, "I do hope you understand what that declaration invites." "Yes," Adrian replied. "It invites honesty." A murmur ran through the room, then died under the weight of his expression. I have spent enough years arranging my life for the convenience of others' expectations. I do not intend to continue. Anyone who finds Miss Whitmore's presence objectionable may keep that objection and do me the kindness of keeping it far from my house. No one answered. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Adrian felt not merely indifferent to London's opinion, but entirely free of it. The next evening he stood once more outside Eleanor's apartment. When she opened the door and saw him, she did not step back immediately, but neither did she invite him in. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I thought we had finished speaking." "We have not." Something in his voice must have reached her, because after a moment she moved aside. Clara, hearing him, appeared behind her mother, with instant delight. "Mr. Adrian." He bent to kiss the top of her hair before straightening again. Eleanor closed the door behind him. "What are you doing here?" He looked at her, really looked as though every hesitation of the past weeks had narrowed to this one moment. "I have spent my life," he said, "doing what was expected of a duke." She did not speak. "I have honored my father's name. I have managed every estate, attended every dull dinner, accepted every obligation, and stood silent whenever silence seemed the proper cost of rank." He took one step toward her. "But I do not wish to spend the rest of my life doing what London expects of me." Her expression changed, though she was still guarding herself. "Adrian." He dropped to one knee before she could finish. Eleanor stared, color draining from her face. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, and for the first time in his life the words that mattered most seemed beautifully simple. "Will you marry me?" She looked down at him as if the room had tilted beneath her feet. "Do you understand what you are asking?" she whispered. "What it would mean." "Yes," he said. "It would mean that I should finally have a home and not merely a house. It would mean that the two people I want most in this world would belong beside me in it." Tears filled her eyes so suddenly that she turned away a little, as though ashamed of them. "Adrian." Then he rose, turned, and went down to Clara's height. "I have another question," he said. She clasped her hands behind her back, alert and solemn. "If I marry your mother, Clara, would you allow me to be your father, not in name only, in all the ways that matter?" She did not hesitate. She launched herself at him with such force, he nearly lost balance. "Yes." Her arms wrapped around his neck. He held her close, and she whispered into his shoulder, "Can I call you Papa?" His throat tightened. When he answered, his voice was unsteady with feeling. "It would be the greatest honor of my life." When he looked up, Eleanor was crying openly. Now one hand against her mouth, the other pressed to her chest, as though she could not contain what filled it. At last she nodded. "Yes," she said, "yes." Their wedding took place some months later in a small old church on the outskirts of London, where stone held the memory of centuries, and roses climbed the low wall outside in pale early summer bloom. There were no grand processions, no endless line of titled guests, no glittering spectacle arranged to satisfy society's appetite. Those who came were few and chosen carefully. Margaret stood beside Eleanor with the protective tenderness of a sister who had long ago given herself permission to love beyond blood. Clara wore a small white dress and carried flower petals with such solemn concentration that one might have thought the fate of the kingdom rested in the accuracy of her scattering. When Adrian saw her step into the church ahead of Eleanor, he smiled in a way many London guests would scarcely have recognized had they been present. Not because it was broader than his usual smiles, those had always been rare enough, but because it came from a place in him that had once been locked and was now irrevocably open. Eleanor walked toward him in simplicity rather than splendor, and that suited her far better. She was not a fantasy dressed for admiration. She was the woman who had built a life out of hardship and gentleness, who had taught him without intending to that warmth was stronger than etiquette, and that a child's trust was holier than reputation. After the ceremony, they returned to Blackwood Manor. This time, when Clara ran laughing across the lawn, no one in the household looked startled. The servants smiled openly now. The great front doors stood wide. Reed himself waited there, and when Adrian stepped from the carriage, with Eleanor on one arm and Clara racing ahead, the old butler allowed himself a rare expression of feeling. "Your Grace," he said, then corrected himself with the faintest glance toward Eleanor and Clara. "I believe the house has become what it was always meant to be." Years passed. Not quickly, not vaguely, but in the particular way happy years do, marked by habits, illnesses, birthdays, Christmas fires, muddy shoes, in hallways, books left open in drawing rooms, guests who stayed too long, dogs Clara begged for and eventually received letters, lessons, garden parties, and quiet evenings in which Eleanor read while Adrian pretended not to be distracted by watching her. Blackwood Manor changed in 1,000 small ways. Children's books appeared in the library. Flowers from the garden appeared in jars where once only cut crystal had stood. Clara's drawings, though, improved, with age still found their way onto surfaces no decorator would have approved. There was laughter now, often enough that even the walls seemed to answer it. And years later, when Clara was older, old enough to braid her own hair and ask questions with even more strategy than before, she would sometimes climb into Adrian's study, settle herself on the arm of his chair in defiance of all furniture etiquette, and ask Papa, "How did you meet Mama?" He always told the same story. He told her about the rainy evening in London, about the empty chair in the tea room and the cold Earl Grey, and the certainty that he had been left waiting for nothing. At this point, Clara always interrupted laughing. And then I came in. And then Adrian would say, "You came in." With "What did I say?" he would look toward the window where Eleanor might be standing in afternoon light, or sitting nearby with her sewing, or a book, and smile. "You said, 'My mommy's late.'" Liked. Clara would grin, pleased anew each time by the importance of this line in family history. "And what did you think you were waiting for?" she once asked. He looked at her, then at Eleanor, then around the room that had ceased to be empty long ago. "I thought he said that I was waiting for a date." Clara leaned closer. "And what did you find?" He rested a hand over hers. "A family." And because the truth never lost its wonder, he would always add softly, almost to himself. It all began because a little girl walked into a tea room and told the truth. Thank you for staying with this story to the very end. Sometimes the greatest changes in life begin with the smallest moments, like a little girl simply saying, "My mommy's late." If this story touched you, let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next heartfelt story. There are many more unforgettable journeys waiting for you here.